was teaching philosophy at my university, and I had a friend who was a high school teacher, and he called me up and said, you know, I'm doing something different in my class tomorrow. Why don't you come along? So I came along, and I'll summarize. I mean, what I saw him doing was challenging his students to think about whether what was written in their textbook was accurate information, because he had another book that said just the opposite. Okay? And these students were really, they were puzzled, and they found that one book was published in the United States, the other in Britain, and they said, well, the US book is the best one. And they talked a little bit and they realized, well, there are plenty of books published in the US that are not so reliable. So they thought about, you know, what they needed to find out about these two books to decide which one was the best one. And as they talked about it and as they looked things up and they went to the internet, they realized that they couldn't tell, okay, that the authors were, you know, roughly similar in their knowledge of history, and when they tried to find out where the authors got their information, they found first-hand sources about the period in history that the authors were writing about, which was before the authors were born. It was 200 years earlier. And they found conflicting information in the eyewitnesses. One eyewitness said they saw this, another eyewitness said they saw that. Okay, and these kids said, gee, that's just like today. You know, people tell you different things about what they see. And if they seem like they're not lying and they're being honest, okay, it's hard to tell which is right. And they said, that's how we feel about these books. You can't, you know, there's nothing that we looked at that shows us that one of these books is more accurate than the other. So they then criticized the writers of the books. They said, these guys made up stories, you know, that weren't supported by the facts. And they said, gee, now it makes us suspicious of every history book. You know, what's the real history and what's the stories that they make up to fill in. Okay. But with regard to these two, they had to say, well, these authors should have said, to this day, we don't know what really happened. Okay? And that would have been more honest. So I thought, whoa, I mean, that's wonderful. These students are the teachers giving them power to stand back and criticize their textbooks. Okay? Most of the time, students feel they're slaves to their textbooks. Okay? And I thought, gee, every teacher in the world needs to hear this. So that sort of switched me into thinking how it could be communicated to other teachers. I thought we should help everybody in the world, but then I thought, oh yeah, right. So let's concentrate on students in classrooms.
I remember a moment of illumination. I went to MIT for both my undergraduate work and my doctoral work, and I was a mathematics major who also became interested in artificial intelligence, which is how you get machines to think, computers to think. When you study artificial intelligence, you also try to learn something about human cognition, because it informs how you might explore getting machines to think. Well, as part of that, I remember around 1965 or 66 reading a very well-known book by a mathematician called Georgi Polya, P-O-L-Y-A, called How to Solve It. Polya was a mathematician, but he was very interested in the thinking process. And in the book, he wrote about various strategies for problem solving. Now, what was provocative for me was this. I was, happily, very good at mathematical problem solving. So I took my courses, and I almost never failed to solve a problem. I almost always solved the problems. But I had very little awareness of how I went about it. So here is Polya's book. and I started to read Polya's book, and he would describe strategies like splitting a problem into parts. So you could organize your thinking by separating a problem into part A and part B. And I read that and said, oh yeah, I do that. And then he would write about solving a simpler problem first to get a start on the more complex problem. And I read that and said, oh yeah, I do that. And so on all the way through the book. He talks about this strategy, and I found I almost always already knew the strategy, but I didn't know it in a conscious, deliberate, metacognitive way. It was just kind of part of the repertoire I had accumulated. And to this day, I don't know where I got those strategies. I think I probably made up some of them. Maybe I picked some of them up from other students. I just don't know. But there they were. So that was a moment of enlightenment for me. A moment where I said, oh, wow, there's all this thinking stuff going on, and I'm pretty good at it, but I don't really know what I'm doing. But thanks to Polya, now I understand better what I'm doing. Well, that was an important first step. A couple of years later, I became associated with Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And that's another story, how that happened, but it basically allowed me to support this interest in human cognition and thinking. So ever since that project began in 1967, I've spent a lot of my time coming to understand better the nature of thinking and how we can foster better thinking in students.
Just because people can go to the beach and swim doesn't mean they swim well, okay? And thinking, people think all the time, but they make a lot of mistakes when they're thinking. They skip things, they simplify things, and that's what we're concerned about. Traditional schools, they're taught to memorize things, and rarely are they taught to stand back and avoid, these errors in their thinking. So that's, to me, why it's very, very important to help teachers learn how to do that. If somebody is making a mistake, then you want to help them figure out how to do it so they don't make mistakes. And then, help them to practice that so that they get better at it.
I feel that that's what school is supposed to be for. Sometimes we forget what schools are for. Schools become endeavors in themselves. Let's get a good grade. Let's do well on the test. But we don't educate children so that they can do better in school and better in the next grade and better in the grade after that. The idea of education is to serve the lives students live, the larger lives as adults, as citizens, as friends, as community members, and so forth and so on. So, of course, we want to help them to think better because it helps them to navigate their larger lives. And we want to help them to understand their school content in ways that spreads out into their larger lives. It's terribly important, and sometimes it's something that gets forgotten in education. Sometimes education seems to be self-serving rather than serving its larger purposes. So I am very much for an approach to education that serves its larger purposes.